Global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. This infamous quote, delivered by Senate Republican Jim Inhofe in the early 2000s, has been echoed by many in the Republican Party, from local officials to other senators to President Trump himself. But with such high-ranking officials pushing this claim, it raises a serious question. How could it not be true? I mean, politicians wouldn't lie to us, right? But here's the thing. These kinds of statements don't just stay in Congress. They shape public opinion. They create camps. They influence how we, as everyday people, see the world. So to everyone watching this, I bet I can describe your views on climate change in just 3 guesses. You either think climate change does not exist and is siphoning billions of dollars from the economy. You think climate change may or may not be a threat, but it really doesn't matter as much as the Democrats say it does. Or you think climate change is going to destroy our world, but the bureaucratic and political mess it's become has wasted so much time that we're just too late to do anything. These 3 perspectives might seem wildly different, almost like they cancel each other out. But what if I told you they all serve the same purpose? In fact, if I were an executive at an oil and gas company, I'd be thrilled if you held any of these views. Why? Because they all lead to inaction, division, and confusion. You see, all these perspectives are exactly those which big corporations and oil moguls want us to have. We're all being played, and despite this issue never being liberal versus conservative, or Republican versus Democrat, these companies have made us feel like these are the only groups we can associate with, and stamped each group with the tag of a specific party, making political parties pick a side. No matter what your belief on climate change is, I hope that this video opens your eyes to some of the truths of climate change and the ways in which corporations have lied to us. Before there's any chance of us changing our opinions though, we have to actually understand where the evidence behind climate change comes from. The climate has been changing since the dawn of the Earth nearly 4.5 billion years ago. Obviously, humans weren't around to actually measure and observe the climate millions and billions of years ago, and so we need to use other methods called proxies to determine what the climate might have been like throughout history. Various methods exist, from extracting ice cores to analyzing the composition of ocean sediments, in which we're able to look at trapped gas particles and chemicals and determine what the atmosphere might have been composed of in a given time period. The rock record alone gives us evidence of how the climate has changed over the past many hundreds of millions of years. If we look at how the climate has changed over the past 70 million years, based on what we know from these proxies, we see that global temperatures were much higher, on average 15 degrees Celsius higher than they are now. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, this is proof that climate change does not matter. But let's go a bit further in time and see why this is not the case. The temperature of the Earth began to cool for the next tens of millions of years until the earliest forms of life began to appear about 1 to 2 million years ago. Only 300,000 years ago, the earliest Homo sapiens, our species, were walking the Earth. Now, if we look all the way to today's temperatures, we see that throughout their entire life history, humans have evolved under a relatively small range of temperatures, a range of about 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. In just the last few hundreds to thousands of years, we as humans have developed our societies in such a way that fits our climate. We are a species that relies on stable agricultural systems and have developed infrastructure that depends on relatively predictable weather patterns. So, it's clear that even though the Earth has been much hotter than it is now at some point in history, humans and our civilizations would unequivocally not be able to survive. Also, at this point, I want to make it clear that all these changes shown so far are natural climate change. They're changes that we have observed throughout Earth's history, far before humans were present. What's important to us is anthropogenic climate change, meaning changes that are specifically caused by humans. When we say climate change, we are talking about the anthropogenic one, not the natural one. To the people who don't believe that humans are altering the climate, give me a few minutes to present the science behind how we know humans are causing it, and then you can make your own decision. First of all, I want to make the connection between greenhouse gases and warming. Greenhouse gases have been well documented in their heat-trapping capabilities since Joseph Fourier and Eunice Foote first described aspects of the greenhouse effect in the early 1800s. Basically, greenhouse gases have a specific atomic structure allowing them to shake and absorb infrared radiation, which in this context you can just think of as heat that comes from the Earth. This process all starts when sunlight hits the Earth from the sun. The Earth then warms up and emits heat in the form of infrared radiation. This infrared radiation is then absorbed by greenhouse gases, which shake and re-emit some of it back down to Earth, essentially trapping it in the atmosphere and heating the atmosphere up as long as the greenhouse gases persist. If you need proof that this is actually true, let's look back at the graph from before. If we now add a graph of historical changes in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, it's almost astounding how closely the graphs line up. We can see that during any period where carbon dioxide concentrations are higher than normal, temperature is higher than normal, and vice versa. But before we blindly agree with this idea and don't accept anything else, we need to find a way to prove that greenhouse gases cause this warming, and that we're not just seeing a correlation between them. There are a few lines of evidence that we can use to prove causation, aside from the physics I've already mentioned. One line of evidence is that greenhouse gases, and specifically carbon dioxide, absorb very specific wavelengths of light, typically thermal infrared radiation, which I described as heat a second ago. Well, it just so happens that we can measure the wavelengths of heat escaping from the atmosphere. We see that in the specific wavelengths of carbon dioxide heat absorbance, less of that wavelength of heat is escaping the atmosphere, which is exactly what we would expect if there's greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere contributing to warming. This may not be enough proof for you, but we'll have plenty more to come. For now, I think it's safe to at least say that greenhouse gases naturally cause warming in the atmosphere. Now, we need to look at two things. How is the temperature of the Earth changing, and are humans causing it? If we look at this graph, we can see that since about 1850 to 1900, the temperature of the Earth has been steadily rising. The late 1700s and early 1800s are right about when the Industrial Revolution started picking up steam. This industrialization sparked the beginning of widespread fossil fuel use, primarily emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. For simplicity, we'll call the years before the Industrial Revolution and the years before warming pre-industrial times. Since 1850, the temperature of the Earth has risen over 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2.63 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of you might be saying, there's no way humans have emitted enough carbon dioxide to cause all that warming. Well, let me break it down into two parts. First, let's prove that this increase in temperature is, in fact, caused by carbon dioxide and is possible, aside from whether or not humans caused it. Over the last few 100,000 years, the Earth has cycled through hot and warm periods known as interglacial and glacial periods, or ice ages. In interglacial or hot periods, the average concentration of carbon dioxide was around 280 parts per million. For ease of understanding, don't worry too much about parts per million. It's just a measurement of how concentrated a gas is in the atmosphere. If you double concentration, you double the amount of a gas in the atmosphere. During cold or glacial periods, the average concentration of carbon dioxide is around 180 parts per million. In the last few thousands of years, the Earth has entered into an interglacial period. During this time, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was right about 280 parts per million. But if we look back to the last few hundreds of years, around the 1800s, the concentration of carbon dioxide has been quickly rising, and if you look at the 2025 concentrations, carbon dioxide exists in the atmosphere at a concentration of nearly 430 parts per million. Which, by the way, is a concentration of carbon dioxide that the Earth has not experienced since over a few tens of millions of years ago. So it's clear that this increase in carbon dioxide is causing the warming. And because it doesn't follow historical trends, the easiest explanation would be that this increase in carbon dioxide is coming from the human emission of fossil fuels. But, as has been questioned for decades, how do we know this isn't just from natural causes? Maybe humans are causing some, but not all of the carbon dioxide to enter the atmosphere. Well, first off, let's establish what we know. We know that the Earth has warmed by over 1.5 degrees Celsius, and carbon dioxide is causing the warming. Now we need to prove that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is unequivocally from humans. There are a few clear lines of evidence that prove the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is from humans. First, we track how many fossil fuels we burn per year based on production and consumption data, and on average, we emit about 37 metric tons of carbon dioxide worth of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every year. We know, based on basic biological and physical principles, that the ocean and biosphere, plants and animals, absorb about 50% of this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Also, it is a well-established mathematical principle that adding 7.8 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere will increase the concentration of carbon dioxide by 1 part per million. So, if we take our 37 billion tons of emitted carbon dioxide, then cut this in half to account for the carbon dioxide taken out by the biosphere, 18.5 billion metric tons remain in the atmosphere. If we then divide these 18.5 billion metric tons by 7.8 billion metric tons, which corresponds to increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations by 1 part per million, we see that our original 37 billion metric tons every year would increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere by about 2.4 parts per million. Every year, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere changes by over 2 parts per million, so this is exactly what we would expect. There is also another unequivocal scientific proof for the human emission of fossil fuels. The element carbon comes in different isotopes. Isotopes are elements that contain the same number of protons, but different number of neutrons. So, all carbon atoms have 6 protons, but they can be found with 6, 7, or 8 neutrons. These isotopes are called C12 for 6 protons and 6 neutrons, C13 and C14. C12 is the most common isotope of carbon and is the most abundant isotope, making up about 99% of carbon. Plants, which use carbon to grow, primarily consist of C12 because it's easier to take up during photosynthesis. They also have small amounts of C13 and C14. However, C14 is radioactive and has a half-life of about 5,700 years. What does this mean? If you sample the carbon-14 from a dead plant now, and then sample it again 5,700 years later, there will only be half as much C14, and then in another 5,700 years, there will be half of that, and so on. So, older organic matter, or plants, that become fossilized over millions of years and become coal will have virtually no C14. What we've seen in the atmosphere for the last 100 years is that the ratio of C12 to C13 is increasing, meaning there is significantly more C12 than C13. In addition, the concentration of C14 is rapidly decreasing. Both of these findings are exactly what we would expect if the carbon dioxide is coming from coal or oil, which are primarily fossilized plants from millions of years ago, because they have higher amounts of C12 and less C14. Now, how do we know this carbon dioxide isn't coming from some other natural source of C12, such as volcanoes? Well, the sources of carbon for volcanoes are much different than for plants. Magma in the mantle is enriched with C13, meaning if volcanic eruptions were to blame for carbon dioxide increases, the concentration of C13 would be rapidly increasing. But this is not what we see. So, now we know unequivocally that humans are causing the increase in carbon dioxide. But maybe at this point you still aren't even convinced that greenhouse gases cause the warming. Well, then I'll explain how every other common argument for natural climate change is wrong. Most often, people argue that temperature increases in the atmosphere are either from changes in the sun, volcanoes, or natural cycles like ENSO. First, the sun argument is flawed in a few ways. The sun has in fact increased in brightness by about 30% in the last 4.5 billion years. But if we look at just the last 2 centuries, when Earth's rapid warming started, total solar irradiance increased by a tiny amount. In fact, in the last few decades, as the Earth has continued to warm, solar irradiance, or the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, has actually gone down. On top of this, the atmosphere is a really good indicator that the sun's energy is not causing these temperature changes. If the sun was sending more energy to the Earth, then the entire atmosphere would be warming. However, we see that the stratosphere, the second layer in the atmosphere, is actually cooling, so sun changes can't be causing the warming. Next, the volcano argument was proven mostly wrong based on the composition of carbon isotopes it emits. However, I can take it one step further. Volcanoes also emit aerosols, which are small suspended particles. The way they interact with the atmosphere is interesting because they are highly reflective and reflect a lot of the sunlight that hits the Earth back into space. So, if massive volcanic eruptions were to blame, we would likely actually see global temperatures decreasing, and this is supported by many past major volcanic eruptions. Finally, the ENSO or El Niño Southern Oscillation argument is probably the most reasonable. ENSO consists of El Niño and La Niña global circulations, which are shifts in air and ocean circulations. During El Niño periods, global temperatures typically increase. However, during La Niña periods, global temperatures typically decrease. If we look at global trends of El Niño and La Niña, it seems reasonable to attribute the warming to this cycle. I mean, look at it. Almost every few years, El Niño is hitting record temperatures. But what we're looking at is correlation. El Niño is getting warmer every year not because it is causing these warmer temperatures, but because the atmosphere is already warmer due to climate change. Let's try to make more sense of this. Average Earth temperatures are increasing due to climate change and greenhouse gases. So, of course, every new phase of El Niño will be, on average, hotter than the one before it, because the baseline temperature of the Earth is already getting hotter. Notice how after multiple El Niño and La Niña events, the temperature of the Earth increases during normal years. This wouldn't make sense if El Niño was causing the globe to warm, because we see warming even when it isn't occurring. Also, we see normal years warming even after La Nina events, which would make no sense since La Nina cools the Earth. So, El Nino is essentially just adding onto the warming that is already happening on the globe. I want you to also notice these yellow dots. These are years with volcanoes. Notice how the temperature is decreasing? And finally, the age-old argument. Earth's climate has always changed. Yeah, this is true, buddy, but it's an argument that has been created by people who can't comprehend or visualize the scope of climatic existence. Yes, the climate has always changed, but the difference in today's warming is time and rate. Remember earlier when I said at one point the Earth was 15 degrees Celsius hotter than it is now? Over the tens of thousands of years it took to reach that average temperature, the atmosphere warmed at a rate of about 0.0008 degrees Celsius per year, or 0.001 degrees Fahrenheit per year. Looking even at this little period where we are transitioning from a glacial period to an interglacial period, which took about 5,000 years, global temperatures increased by about 0.001 degrees Celsius per year. When we now look at just the last 50 years, we see that global temperatures have increased at a rate of nearly 0.02 degrees Celsius per year. This is about 20 times faster than both of the previous example periods of warming. In the first example, known as the Eocene thermal optimum, where it was 15 degrees Celsius hotter on average, it took thousands of years to see the warming that we've experienced in just the last century. So, let's go over what we've established. Climate change is real, it is not natural, it is caused by humans, and temperatures are increasing because of fossil fuels. But now, for all those who still don't care, let's explain why this matters. I think one of the main points of contention when it comes to people thinking about climate change is weather, specifically changes in extreme weather. This is contentious because, as humans, we love using personal anecdotes to prove what we're saying. Anyone can go outside in the winter, feel cold, and say, see, climate change isn't real. I mean, I get it. How could climate change be real if winter still exists? The problem is, we humans are flawed, and climate change doesn't work on a scale of space or time that we can easily comprehend. Yeah, one year might have a cooler winter than the year before it, but there are also thousands of different processes happening in the atmosphere every year, such as La Nina, which causes a short period of cooling. To really understand the scope of climate change, we would have to spend multiple decades experiencing winter in the same spot to accurately assess a change. And, in fact, most of you watching probably have done that and have noticed a change. But there's always going to be that one person that either hasn't been alive long enough, or has, but goes, bro, how could it be warming if there's still snow on the ground every winter? So, let's not even think about weather right now, even though it's extremely important and extremely detrimental to the future US economy. We'll talk about it later, but for now, let's look at the pure science of how climate change will directly impact your life. Have you ever heard about Zika virus, dengue fever, or West Nile virus? If you're from North America or Europe, I'm sure you've heard about these diseases, but you've never really had to worry about them. In fact, most of us just associate them with being isolated in Africa or tropical countries. Well, not anymore. These viruses are only isolated in equatorial countries because they're transmitted by mosquitoes and other vectors that live in warm tropical habitats. But the problem here is that as temperatures rise across the globe, these species of mosquitoes will be able to migrate to newer areas. If you need some real data, by 2050 the world will warm enough that over 1 billion more people will live in climates where Zika can spread. And yes, this includes southern parts of America. Similar patterns will also be seen for all of the other mentioned viruses, and more. We're talking about the potential for devastating effects on human life and serious developmental effects for children who experience viruses like Zika. So that's one piece for those of you that think climate change doesn't matter. In our lifetime, transmissible diseases will become worse and more people will die as the Earth warms. But what about things we don't necessarily contract from a virus? In the United States, nearly 60% of adults have a chronic illness. That means most of the people watching this probably suffer from one, and it's only going to get worse with climate change. As the globe warms from fossil fuel emissions, two important things happen. Tropospheric ozone, or smog, becomes significantly more common, especially in urban areas, and terrestrial vegetated areas become drier. Smog is important because it's a direct pollutant for our lungs, worsening asthma and respiratory infections. In the next few decades, we'll see that bad air days, or days where the air is harmful to human health per year, will double. This is also worsened by wildfires. Dry conditions have been contributing to massive and severe wildfires throughout the globe, and they're getting worse every year. The smoke and soot that is released from these fires is horrible for human health. increasing the risk of chronic respiratory diseases in those who are exposed to poor air quality. Together, poor air quality from smog and smoke will also increase the likelihood of cardiovascular diseases and certain types of cancers. But the most important impact from climate change, or global warming, simply comes from heat. Let me paint a picture for you. About 12,000 years ago, the Earth was in an ice age, with ice covering much of Europe and upper parts of North America. You might remember this period of time from history class when humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge, which was exposed, or from the extinction of the woolly mammoth. During this time, the average global temperature was about 8 degrees Celsius or 46 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1850, before fossil fuels massively started warming the Earth, the global average temperature was about 14 degrees Celsius or 56 degrees Fahrenheit. From the last ice age to 1850, this was all a natural shift. Over about the last 5,000 years, the Earth began heating up from natural processes and increased in temperature by only about 6 degrees to go from an ice age to a warm period. Keep this 6-degree temperature change in mind. If we look after 1850 to now, we've already seen about a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. Most of us can physically see the changes that have happened as the world has warmed during the last few decades, but it might be too little to convince some. By 2100, most climate models predict that the Earth will warm by at least another 1.5 degrees to a few degrees. Tacked onto the warming we've already seen, this could be anywhere from a 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius total increase in temperatures since 1850. This is assuming that some action is taken to reduce fossil fuels, and scientists have agreed on this range assuming we take action. However, if absolutely no action is taken and we burn through the fossil fuel supply, we could see total warming of more than 5 degrees Celsius. I don't want to be alarmist, and I want to make it clear that over 5 degrees of warming is unlikely unless there's massive international cooperation to do nothing on climate change. But this paints a very scary picture for us. If the last ice age, a period where the world was covered in massive ice sheets, occurred when the globe was only 6 degrees colder on average, imagine a world where the globe is 4, 5, or even 6 degrees Celsius warmer. We're talking about massive agricultural devastation, public health crises, and devastation of societies that we have built. Now this might sound alarmist, and this is exactly what I want you to think, because this is exactly how major companies and major polluters want you to feel. They want you to feel helpless, like nothing you do matters because the globe will be a walking hell in the future. But that's only true with inaction on fossil fuels. In fact, the only reason I even bring this up is to show you what's at stake if we don't do anything at all, and fall into the oil and gas industry's trap. Keep in mind, with all this talk of the damages of climate change, we haven't even considered weather changes. Most of us have probably been affected by or know someone affected by extreme and damaging weather events like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria, and the Palisades Fire, and countless others. Climate change will increase the severity and frequency of events like this continually as temperatures get worse. Heat waves, droughts, and floods will easily contribute to millions of deaths per year, not to mention the economic impact that these events will have on the global economy. Studies suggest that by 2050, nearly $38 trillion of damages will be realized from climate change. In vulnerable places throughout the US, where damage from extreme weather is constant, insurance is going to be virtually impossible to attain. Spending power throughout the globe is going to be hit too, especially as crop yields are devastated and the price of food rises. Now that we know what's at stake for our own health and economic standing, we need to address the doomist idea that it's too late to do anything about climate change. Some people point out that even if we were to completely stop emitting fossil fuels right now, the over 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming we've already seen will be locked in for the next few hundreds of years. And this is true. This is because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for decades to centuries. So all the fossil fuels emitted here will continue to trap heat even if more carbon dioxide isn't being emitted. I want you to think of it like an escalator. Imagine you're on a one-way escalator, and as it's going up, the temperature is increasing. When you get off of that escalator onto a floor, you're stuck at that specific temperature. In the same way, when we stop emitting fossil fuels, we'll be stuck at that temperature for a long time. This honestly sounds like a really good reason to give up on climate change efforts, but it's not. Think back to the fact that a change of only 6 degrees separates us from the last ice age. That's a tiny change, and it means that every time global temperatures increase or decrease by even a single degree, massive changes occur in the global climate. Right now, we're at about 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. But this is better than 2 degrees, much better than 3 degrees, and so much better than 4 degrees, and so on. Each degree of warming will add to the catastrophic effects that climate change will have on the Earth. we're talking about measurable differences, with each degree of warming being the difference between trillions of dollars of damages and millions of annual deaths. So, despite the warming we've already seen, action is necessary and can literally prevent millions of deaths. I also want to address the idea of climate tipping points, which you may have heard about. These have been pushed to the public for a while and were originally a strategy to spur action on climate change. But in reality, these specific tipping points or thresholds at which the entire climate will be too far gone are really only to describe specific aspects of the environment, such as ice melt or coral reef die-off. And when we generalize them to the entire climate, we promote inaction because they feed into the doomist idea that it's too late. Next time you see a post about how we're approaching a tipping point in the climate, acknowledge it, but take it with a grain of salt. It's not too late, and every degree of warming we prevent will be beneficial to all of us. I've mentioned the deception of the oil industry a lot in this video, but what did they actually do? Well, the oil industry has been deceiving the public on climate change for decades, trying to convince us that climate change was not urgent and that the science behind it was insufficient. You might ask yourself, if climate change threatens everyone, wouldn't the oil and gas industry, run by people who live on this planet too, want to protect the Earth? Why would they spend decades trying to convince us that climate change isn't real or that nothing could be done? The answer is simple as it is devastating. They knew the truth, but they chose profit over people. They chose deliberate deception to continue lining their pockets for decades. A perfect example of this deception comes from the oil and gas mogul ExxonMobil, a major fossil fuel producer. Throughout the 1900s, climate change was beginning to garner attention by the scientific community, and heavy attention was put on it in the late 1900s. In 1977, James F. Black, a senior scientist at Exxon, warned executives that increasing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide could alter the climate of the Earth. During this time, Exxon and other companies were attending congressional hearings discussing the relationship between greenhouse gases and global warming. By the 1980s, the evidence behind climate change and the effects of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere became clearer and harder to dispute. In fact, starting around this time until the early 2000s, the company began developing modeled projections of how fossil fuels would impact the climate. So far, we've seen that these models have been shockingly accurate and predicted nearly the exact warming trend we've seen within an extremely small margin of error. Evidence continued to build throughout the 80s, and it became overwhelmingly clear that climate change would be a problem. By 1988, Exxon had recognized this mounting evidence, so they delivered an internal memo to the company laying out a strategy to cast doubt on the severity of climate change. In the first few lines of the memo, Exxon spokesperson writes, "The greenhouse gas effect may be one of the most significant environmental issues for the 1990s, and the principal greenhouse gases are byproducts of fossil fuel combustion." But despite this acknowledgement, the company had to develop a plan. How could they maintain profits despite the science behind climate change? Simple. Deny, deny, deny. Not the existence of climate change, but the science behind it. Their plan was to make climate change seem distant and unimportant by casting uncertainty on its severity. In the memo, the spokesperson emphasizes that climate models are not very reliable because approximations are used to represent poorly understood interactions. It is too early to specify the severity of potential impacts of the enhanced greenhouse effect. And the key position sent to Exxon executives emphasized the uncertainty in scientific conclusions regarding the potential enhanced greenhouse effect. If we think back to this period of time, maybe this seems valid. I mean, how can they be certain in the reliability of these models? Well, this isn't really the issue. The problem is in the way Exxon is framing the issue around the science. By saying not very reliable or uncertain, the memo implies that climate models can't be trusted at all. But this isn't true. The models were clear that there would be warming, it would be severe, and it would come from greenhouse gases. The uncertainties in these models at most would broaden the range of predicted warming, not the direction of warming. For instance, using uncertain assumptions, some models would predict 2 degrees of warming, while other models would predict 4 degrees of warming. But despite this range of projected increases in temperature, it's still clear that the Earth would warm, and Exxon knew this. But they rode this uncertainty train as long as possible, denying the severity of climate change to protect their profits. By the 1990s, Exxon had founded and joined groups like the Global Climate Coalition, a group vested in protecting fossil fuel interests that supported well-known climate skeptics who were branded as climate experts. For reference, we're talking about people like Patrick Michaels, who bet in 1999 that a global cooling trend would occur throughout the 2000s, and that the world would go 25 years without seeing any warming. Around this time, Exxon also hired Brian Flannery, who worked with various universities to improve climate projections, and he told these researchers to embrace the uncertainty in all of this. By 1998, the oil industry was formulating a strategy to drill down this uncertainty in the science behind climate change. In a leaked document developed by the American Petroleum Institute, the industry laid out their plan. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in climate science, and media understands uncertainties in climate science. To achieve this, companies like Exxon spent the next few decades developing advertorials to emphasize the uncertainty of climate change to the public, despite the unequivocal evidence mounted behind it. Scientists like Geoffrey Supran have sifted through tons of these oil industry documents and advertorials, finding that while over 80% of scientific articles on climate change acknowledge its importance and urgency, nearly 80% of all advertorials developed by oil companies cast doubt on it. In fact, Supran's research shows that as documents within the oil industry become more publicly accessible, more doubt is cast on the seriousness of climate change. From this graph, we see that internal memos, documents only seen by executives within the oil company, primarily acknowledge the seriousness of climate change. The vast majority of peer-reviewed documents, or those reviewed by scientists, also showed a similar trend. However, as we see documents that are more accessible by the public, especially advertorials developed by oil companies, doubt is cast on the seriousness of climate change. Just take it from one of Exxon's scientists studying the effects of their actions.
I was greatly distressed by the climate science denial program that Exxon's front office launched around the time I stopped working as a consultant. The advertisements that Exxon ran in major newspapers raising doubt about climate change were contradicted by the scientific work we had done and continued to do. I cannot see into Exxon management's heart. Whatever its intent, willful ignorance, stymieing an effective response to preserve quarterly profits, they deliberately created doubt when internal research confirmed how serious a threat it was.
But this doesn't even cover all of the oil industry's actions in the public sector. Over the last few decades, Exxon has given over $35 million to various climate-denying organizations. But surely not the government, right? The oil industry funneled over $219 million into the 2024 election to protect their profits. Exxon alone gave over $1.5 million to members of Congress and corporate lobbying groups in 2022. Remember our friend Jim Inhofe from the beginning of the video? The one that called global warming the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people? Yeah, well, he received over $20,000 just from ExxonMobil. By the way, he's infamous for bringing a snowball onto the Senate floor to prove that climate change could not be real. Because how is there snow here? What a really smart guy. I definitely trust him when it comes to the climate. This amount of money allows the oil industry to play puppeteer with our congresspeople, who are also money motivated. It's just a small price for the industry to pay to continue exploiting us for profits. By the early 2000s, warming trends and the accompanying science and projections became too clear to continue casting uncertainty. Exxon, Chevron, and all other oil companies once again had to shift their position. Instead of denying the severity of climate change, the industry began finding ways to delay fossil fuel reductions. Now, without outright denying the science, the company developed specific rhetoric to frame the issue of climate change as one that is not immediately pressing. But what does this reframing of rhetoric mean? Well, it all has to do with the words the industry uses when it talks about climate change. The industry's new favorite word quickly became risk. Advertorials were sent out by companies talking about addressing climate change risks, or discussing the risks to society and ecosystems from climate change. The word risk is ambiguous and softens the blow of climate change. Compare this to the word danger. If someone came up to you and said, "Your child is in danger," you would start freaking out. But what if that same person came up to you and said, "Your child's at risk"? You'd be like, what? At risk of what? It softens the blow and aims to confuse the severity of climate change in the hopes that you won't ask more questions. But how did these canny little oil companies come up with such a clever strategy? Let's not give them that much credit. In fact, they don't deserve any credit. They stole this from the tobacco industry. You know, the one that used to say cigarettes are not harmful, or maybe even good for you, and then transitioned to highlighting the risks of smoking cigarettes when it became obvious that they were bad for you? These two industries are literally mirroring the same tactics. They know that the science is unequivocal, so they're training our brains to tune out the science and soften the immediacy of climate change. After the industry started employing these rhetorical strategies, they had to think of ways to reduce their culpability as drivers of climate change. If people started identifying them as the cause of climate change, not only would their profits be hurt, but devastation could be wrought on the entire industry. So, they did what they do best, and they took another play out of the tobacco industry's book. Just like the tobacco industry, the oil industry began redirecting blame for climate change at consumers. How could we be the ones to blame when we're just the middleman providing oil and gas for people? Consumers are the ones buying it, so how is it our fault? Well, yeah, that might make sense if you didn't spend 4 decades protecting your own profits by denying the science and intentionally leaving people misinformed on the decisions they were making. In fact, oil companies were involved in a lawsuit a couple of years ago for their role in altering the climate, and they argued that they had no duty to warn when they say the alleged impact of fossil fuel use on the global climate has been open and obvious for decades. Wait a minute, decades? You mean the same decades you were saying that the science behind climate change is uncertain and shouldn't be trusted? This idea of consumer blame has infiltrated so deep into normal society that we don't even notice it when we see it. Did you know that the idea of a carbon footprint was created by British Petroleum, a UK-based oil company? Don't get me wrong, I think the idea of a carbon footprint is not inherently bad. We can still make individual changes that promote a better climate. But this is such an obvious shift of blame it's hard to ignore. This carbon footprint was literally created to make us feel like we're the ones to blame, despite oil companies deliberately deceiving us to keep profits up. During this time, oil companies also had to develop a strategy to stay in the game, with renewables becoming cheaper and potentially more economical. They used a strategy of delay called fossil fuel solutionism, the idea that fossil fuels are not only necessary for society, but that they can still be used while the problem of climate change is solved. This idea began pushing the industry to develop technologies that could mitigate fossil fuels. One of these is known as carbon capture and storage. Oil companies use this technology to push the idea that we can mechanically remove carbon from the atmosphere and pump it underground. It sounds like an amazing idea. The only problem is that it's incredibly expensive and will not be a viable option for at least a few decades. But this is a key aspect of delay. Make us think that they're solving the problem or have a solution to the problem. Meanwhile, they have no intention of solving it and are just squeezing as much more money as they can out of us. All of these strategies of delay, rhetoric changes, consumer blame, and fossil fuel solutionism, all aim to keep the emission of fossil fuels acceptable and unchallenged. These strategies have been wildly successful and have percolated into Republican spheres, Democratic spheres, and everywhere in between where they have evolved. We have people who feel like their actions won't make a difference because others aren't doing anything. We have people who think that we can keep burning fossil fuels while developing other ways to reduce climate change. And then we have the doomists, who think no matter what we do, we're doomed because it's too late. I hope the earlier parts of this video have convinced you otherwise. Regardless, all these ways of thinking have evolved from the oil industry's use of delay strategies. Think about it. The oil industry rejoices at these ideas because it allows them to keep lining their pockets. But none of them are correct. The only, and I repeat only, way to reduce climate change is to stop emitting fossil fuels. This is unequivocally the only way to lessen climate change. There is no other immediate solution, and the quicker we start reducing emissions, the better chance we have at reducing the most damage in the future. As long as we're emitting any greenhouse gases, climate change will continue to worsen into the future. By the way, this problem was never partisan. It was never Republican versus Democrat. In fact, we all used to just about agree on the issue. Oil companies split us on this issue, and it's time that we come back together. I don't care if you disagree with renewable energy, whatever, but invest your energy and support into something that will actually make a difference. Don't allow oil companies to keep exploiting us just because you hate the person on the other side of the issue. This issue doesn't have to be, and never was, an issue cut by party lines. The final message from this whole video: emissions must go down. I hope the science presented throughout this video convinces you of that. I don't care how, but this is the science. The rest is up to you.